Deep in the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, where fog curls through the valleys like a living thing and the ridges cast shadows darker than midnight, there lingers a tale that old-timers will not share in daylight. They say the earth itself remembers, and that the soil on one forgotten patch of Kentucky land is soaked not just with rain and time, but with sins too heavy to wash away. On moonless nights, when the whippoorwills fall silent and the trees stand as if holding their breath, that land groans beneath its history. What you're about to hear isn't a ghost story. It isn't some campfire tale crafted to scare children into obedience. This is something else, something whispered, half denied, yet never forgotten. A story that even the wind seems to carry, though no one dares claim ownership of its telling. Hello everyone. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And in the comments, let us know where you're from and what time you're listening. That way YouTube will keep bringing you stories just like this one. Now let us step back in time. The Forgotten Records. In the year 1923, a traveling circuit judge named Robert Kinlon stopped overnight in a small mountain courthouse. The man had handled everything from moonshiner disputes to land squabbles, but what he found that night was unlike anything he had ever read. Beneath a stack of routine property deeds and hunting violations, he uncovered a file so yellowed with age it seemed ready to crumble at his touch. The name scrawled across its cover chilled him before he even turned the first page: Delilah May Whitlock. Inside were depositions, signed testimonies, and the kind of documents that should have been burned long ago if the community truly wished to bury the truth. And yet, here they were, preserved like an unhealed wound. The deeper Kinlon read, the more his hands trembled. For what those records revealed was not merely a crime nor a scandal, but the outline of a nightmare so interwoven with family, faith, and silence that it explained why generations of mountain folk had simply chosen not to speak of it again. The Blackwood bloodline. Long before Delilah May's name ever stained the records, there was the Blackwood family. They had arrived in Kentucky in the early 1800s, led by a patriarch named Josiah Blackwood, who settled on rocky, unwanted land that no farmer desired. Isolated, stubborn, and contemptuous of outsiders, Josiah raised his family in a hollow so deep that outsiders joked sunlight only visited once a day. Josiah was a man of iron will. He built not just cabins but a philosophy, one that placed his family apart from the rest of the world. No preacher ever set foot in their hollow, and no neighbor dared intrude. Josiah told his children that they were chosen, set apart, bearers of a bloodline that must remain pure, untouched by the corruption of valley folk. When Josiah died, his son Ezekiel inherited not only the land but the dangerous ideas. Ezekiel twisted scripture into his own pure doctrine, insisting that God himself had set the Blackwoods apart, demanding that their blood never mix with outsiders. The doctrine was not preached to the world, it was whispered by firelight to his children. Night after night, he quoted distorted verses from Genesis and Leviticus, hammering into their minds the belief that only by marrying within the family could they preserve their divine essence. Most of his children nodded along, afraid or too conditioned to argue. But one daughter, Mary Catherine, listened with hungry devotion. She believed him completely. Mary Catherine's obedience. Mary Catherine Blackwood was born with the quiet intensity of someone destined to follow rather than lead. To her, her father's words were not warnings or guidelines, they were commandments. By the time she turned 16, she had become Ezekiel's most faithful disciple, spreading his teachings to her younger siblings as though she were a prophet in her own right. It was Mary Catherine who first carried Ezekiel's doctrine into practice. She married her cousin, Jeremiah Blackwood, in a ceremony performed by none other than Ezekiel himself, inside the family's makeshift chapel. To the outside community, cousin marriages weren't shocking in isolated hollers. Families often intermingled when distance made other unions near impossible. So the marriage raised no alarm. But the truth was far darker. For before her marriage, Mary Catherine had already borne the weight of her father's sins. Twice she had carried his children. Twice she had suffered stillbirths. Those tiny malformed bodies were buried in the woods behind the family cabin, in graves without markers, without prayers, without acknowledgement. When her third pregnancy ended in a living child, a girl named Delilah May, the family rejoiced. They didn't weep for the deformity of her origins. They didn't question the morality of her conception. Instead, they celebrated her survival as proof they believed that God had smiled on their pure doctrine. But Delilah May's birth was not a blessing. It was the beginning of the family's unraveling. The devil's daughter. From her earliest days, Delilah May was treated differently. The mountain folk, those few who ever glimpsed her, called her the devil's daughter behind closed doors. They whispered that her mismatched eyes, one blue, one green, were the mark of sin itself. To them, it was as though God couldn't decide whether to bless or curse her, so he did both. Inside the Blackwood homestead, Delilah was raised not with shame but with fervor. To Ezekiel she was the proof of his twisted gospel. Each morning he would take her small hand and lead her into the chapel. There, by lamplight, she was made to memorize verses painted across every wall, scripture written not as holy comfort but as shackles. Her childhood was no playground of innocence. It was a theater of indoctrination. Each day reinforced the message. Her blood was sacred, her family chosen, her duty to keep the Blackwood line unbroken. By the time she could read, Delilah had been convinced of a terrible truth. She did not belong to herself. She belonged to the Blackwoods, to their doctrine, to their legacy. And worse, her fate had already been decided. A shadow over the hollow. As the years passed, whispers grew. A family so tightly bound to itself cannot keep its secrets forever. Hunters claimed they saw strange rituals in the Blackwood Hollow. Children from neighboring ridges said they heard cries at night that were not animal, not human, but something in between. But the people of those mountains had their own superstitions, their own burdens. And so they kept their distance. They did not ask questions. They did not climb the ridge to see for themselves. That silence, the silence of neighbors, of preachers, of outsiders, was the soil in which the Blackwood's corruption thrived. Delilah May grew. She was not yet a woman, but already she was a symbol, a vessel for her family's twisted hopes. They whispered of her destiny in the same way they whispered scripture. She would carry the line forward, she would bear children as her mother had, and in doing so she would keep their blood pure. But purity in the Blackwood sense was nothing less than a curse. To be continued? That is where part 1 ends, with the child Delilah May being shaped into something both pitied and feared, a girl born of sin and silence, raised to repeat the cycle. In part 2 we will follow her adolescence, the chilling way her fate was sealed, the rituals her family bound her to, and how the outside world finally began to notice that something was deeply wrong in the Blackwood Hollow. If you've made it this far, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're watching from. And if you're brave enough, tell us, do you believe some bloodlines carry curses? Because the story of Delilah May Blackwood might just convince you. The hollow where Delilah May Blackwood grew into adolescence was more prison than home. By the time she reached her 12th year, she had never seen the inside of a schoolhouse, never spoken with a stranger, never walked more than a few ridgelines from the cabins her family had built. Her world was bounded by timber walls and scripture written in her grandfather's twisted hand. And in that world she was not a child. She was an heir to a doctrine that demanded her body long before she understood what that meant. The locals who dared to speak of her called her cursed. Within her family, however, she was something worse. She was chosen. The lessons of the chapel. Every morning began the same. Her grandfather Ezekiel would lead her into the family's chapel, a drafty shed whose walls were smothered in verses written with ash, paint, even blood from slaughtered livestock. The words of Genesis, Leviticus, and Ezekiel's own hand-stitched interpretations loomed over her. He made her read them aloud. Line after line, day after day, until her voice cracked. And then he would preach. "You are of the sacred blood, Delilah May," he told her. "Our family is set apart, chosen by the Lord, like Israel of old. And just as the patriarchs of Scripture took wives from among their own kin, so too must you. Your womb is the vessel of God's promise." She was too young to understand the depth of his corruption, but she felt the weight of it. Felt the way her mother, Mary Catherine, sat in the shadows nodding along, her eyes hollow, her faith in her father unshakable. When Delilah stumbled over a verse, Ezekiel would grip her chin and force her to look into his eyes. "Weakness is sin," he'd hiss. "You will not bring shame upon this family." By the time she turned 13, Delilah knew the Scriptures by heart. Not as comfort, not as faith, but as chains. The marriage promise. In the winter of her 14th year, the Blackwoods gathered for a private ceremony. Outside, snow buried the mountains in silence. Inside, Delilah stood in front of the family chapel's altar, her heart thundering in her chest. Ezekiel spoke the words. He called it a betrothal. He said it was God's will. And with those words, Delilah was promised, not to an outsider, not to someone she might have chosen, but to her own uncle, one of Ezekiel's sons. The family celebrated as though it were a holy union. They feasted on venison and cornbread, sang hymns warped by Ezekiel's doctrine, and toasted with homemade whiskey. Delilah sat silent, numb, her stomach curdling. The mountain folk beyond the hollow heard whispers of it weeks later. But they dismissed it. Cousins married cousins in those ridges all the time. To them it was peculiar but not shocking. None knew the truth, that Delilah's fate had been sealed by a grandfather who saw her not as a granddaughter, not even as a daughter of God, but as an instrument of his delusion. The first rebellion. But Delilah was not her mother. Mary Catherine had absorbed her father's teachings without question. Delilah, however, felt the cracks forming inside her faith. At night, lying on her straw mattress, she would whisper to herself lines of scripture she had memorized, but she twisted them in her own mind. "The truth shall set you free," she murmured, clutching the thin blanket around her shoulders. The words became a secret prayer, a rebellion so small no one could see it, but in her heart, it burned like fire. And then came the spring of 1905. She was 14 when she first wandered beyond the hollow. Her grandfather had sent her to fetch water from a creek half a mile away. The path wound down through the woods, past rocks slick with moss and trees that leaned like old men listening. That's when she saw him. A boy no older than she, fishing at the creek's bend. His clothes were patched, his face sunburned, but his eyes were clear, unburdened by doctrine, unchained by silence. For a moment they stared at each other, neither speaking. And then he smiled. Just a small smile, nervous, kind. Delilah felt something shift inside her chest, something she had never felt before. She didn't speak to him. She didn't dare. She filled her bucket, turned and ran back to the hollow. But the image of him, the smile, the freedom, haunted her. That night, when Ezekiel preached of purity, when her mother spoke of duty, Delilah whispered her secret prayer again. And this time she added words of her own. "There is more beyond these mountains. There must be." Whispers in the community. By then rumors about the Blackwoods had already grown bolder. Hunters who ventured too close claimed they saw strange fires burning at night, rituals that looked more like pagan rites than Christian worship. A woman from a nearby ridge swore she had heard the wails of infants carried on the wind, cries that were suddenly cut short. Still, the community did not interfere. The Blackwoods were ridge runners, wild folk. Outsiders were unwelcome, and anyone foolish enough to pry risked never coming back. So the whispers remained whispers, and the silence remained silence. That silence gave the Blackwoods room to dig deeper into their madness. Ezekiel's grip. By 1906, Delilah had blossomed into a young woman. And with that transformation came the tightening of Ezekiel's grip. He spoke often of her destiny. He reminded the family of their pure doctrine. He insisted that Delilah's womb was the key to their salvation. Her uncle, the man to whom she had been promised, began to hover around her more. His gaze lingered, his hand brushed hers too long when passing food at the table. Delilah's stomach churned, but her protests were swallowed by the weight of tradition. Her mother, Mary Catherine, offered no comfort. She only told her daughter to obey, to honor her grandfather's will, to keep the bloodline sacred. It was then that Delilah realized her mother was lost, her faith twisted beyond recovery. If Delilah was to escape, she would have to find her own way. The Judge's glimpse. And it is here that the threads of Delilah's life begin to intertwine with the records Judge Robert Kinlawn uncovered in 1923. For among those papers were testimonies, not from the Blackwoods themselves but from neighbors, from drifters, from anyone who had brushed too close to the hollow. One testified that he saw a girl at the creek, eyes mismatched, staring at him like a caged bird. Another swore he overheard chanting in a language that sounded like scripture but bent in unnatural ways. But the most chilling testimony was this. A midwife, long since passed, confessed in writing that she had once been summoned to the Blackwood Hollow. She described a birth gone wrong, a child born twisted, whose cries lasted less than an hour. The family never spoke of it again. They buried the infant before dawn. The midwife's final line was scrawled, barely legible, "The girl, Delilah May, she will be next." To be continued? That is where part 2 ends, with Delilah standing at the edge of her fate, torn between obedience and rebellion, her body claimed by a doctrine she never chose, and the outside world just beginning to sense the horror festering in the Blackwood Hollow. In part 3, we will follow the chilling turn as Delilah's promised union becomes reality, the grotesque births that followed, and the moment when silence could no longer contain the nightmare. If you're still with us, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below. Do you think silence can be just as dangerous as sin? Because in the story of Delilah May Blackwood, silence was the soil in which evil grew. The winter of 1907 came down hard on the Appalachian Mountains. Snow buried the hollers in silence, the ridges creaked under its weight, and smoke curled from cabins like whispers of survival. But inside the Blackwood compound, survival meant something darker. For that was the year Delilah May's fate, long sealed in doctrine and whispers, was carried out. The girl who once stood wide-eyed at the creek, clutching a bucket of water, was now a young woman of 16. And her family had decided she would become something more, the vessel of their pure doctrine. The union. It happened in the chapel as all things did. The air was heavy with wood smoke and candle wax. The walls still bore the painted verses of Ezekiel Blackwood, each line of scripture warped into justification. Delilah stood before the altar, her body trembling. Across from her stood her uncle, her mother's brother, a man twice her age, with eyes that carried hunger instead of devotion. Ezekiel presided. His voice thundered with authority, though his words were stitched together from fragments of the Bible and his own madness. He called it a holy union. He said it was God's will. The family gathered, heads bowed, voices murmuring prayers of thanksgiving. Only Delilah was silent. Inside her chest, her heart screamed, but her lips refused to open. Her silence was not consent, it was survival. By nightfall, the marriage was consummated. And with it, the cycle began. The first child. 9 months later, the hollow was heavy with anticipation. Delilah, pale and weak, lay on a straw mattress while the women of the family hovered. Her mother whispered prayers, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles whitened. The child came in the early hours of morning. Its cries, thin and wavering, echoed against the cabin walls. But when the family looked upon it, the room fell silent. The child was malformed. Its head bore a strange tilt, its limbs fragile, twisted. It did not live more than 3 days. Ezekiel declared it a test of faith. He said God was purging weakness from their bloodline, that future children would bear the true mark of divine approval. The family buried the infant in the woods, unmarked, unwept. Delilah did weep. quietly in the dark when no one could hear. For she did not cry for the child alone. She cried for herself, for the life stolen, for the future shackled, for the knowledge that this was only the beginning. The curse takes root. The second child was born the following year. This one lived longer. A boy, frail but breathing. They named him Ezekiel Jr. after the patriarch himself. But the boy's cries were constant, shrill, as though the world itself was too sharp for his skin. His body twisted with illness before he reached his second year. His death was slow, drawn out, a suffering that the family watched with stoic silence. Again Ezekiel declared it proof of God's testing. Again the family obeyed. The outside community began to whisper. Midwives who had once been called into the hollow refused to return. Hunters who strayed too close said they saw small graves behind the cabin, rows of mounds with no markers. Still no one intervened. Silence remained the safest choice. The devil's daughter. By 1910, Delilah had borne 3 children. None survived past infancy. And yet, with each birth, Ezekiel's obsession only grew. The mountain folk now whispered of her not just as cursed but as dangerous. Some said she carried the devil's mark in her mismatched eyes, one blue, one green. Others swore they saw her wandering the woods at night, muttering prayers, her hair loose, her face streaked with tears. She was no longer simply the Blackwood girl. She was the devil's daughter. The name followed her like a shadow, whispered by neighbors who never dared speak to her face, but always to one another. And though she never chose it, she bore it, just as she bore her children, her sorrow, her silence. The breaking point. It was in the spring of 1911 that Delilah reached her breaking point. She was carrying her 4th child. Her body, worn and frail from years of forced pregnancies, struggled under the weight. One night as the family gathered in the chapel, Ezekiel preached again of purity, of bloodlines, of God's will. Delilah sat in the shadows, her hands cradling her swollen belly, her eyes burning. And then, for the first time in her life, she spoke against him. God does not want this, she said, her voice trembling. God does not bless this. The room froze. Her words fell like stones into still water. Ezekiel's face darkened. He called her wicked, a vessel of Satan, a temptation sent to weaken the family's resolve. But Delilah did not back down. You twist his words, she said, tears spilling down her face. You twist his will. The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Her mother turned away. Her uncle clenched his fists. And Ezekiel raised his hand and struck her. Her rebellion was crushed in an instant. But the seed had been planted. The 4th child. When the 4th child was born, the family did not call a midwife. They handled it themselves. The child, a girl, came into the world limp and silent. Delilah held her in her arms, rocking, praying, begging God to let her live. But the child never opened her eyes. By dawn she was gone. This time something inside Delilah broke. She did not weep. She did not pray. She only sat, staring into the distance, her face blank. And when Ezekiel declared again that it was God's will, she laughed. A hollow, bitter laugh that echoed in the cabin like a curse. The judge's records. Judge Robert Kinlan's papers held chilling detail about this period of Delilah's life. Testimonies described not only the births and deaths but the strange rituals that accompanied them. The Blackwoods, it was said, would gather in the woods at night, bury the children beneath stones, and sing hymns until the first light of dawn. One testimony claimed Ezekiel forced Delilah to stand over each grave and declare her submission to the doctrine. Another claimed she was locked in the chapel for days at a time, her only food bread and water, until she recited scripture without error. Whether all of it was true we may never know. But the weight of those testimonies, recorded by trembling hands, was enough to leave the judge haunted for life. To be continued? That is where part 3 ends. With Delilah broken but not destroyed, her body used, her children buried, her spirit teetering between silence and rebellion. In part 4 we will reach the end of the folktale, The final unraveling of the Blackwood family, the shocking act that ended their line, and the reason Delilah May's name still echoes through Appalachian whispers to this day. If you've stayed with us this far, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Tell us, do you think some stories should stay buried? Or does the truth always claw its way to the surface, no matter how deep it's hidden? Because in the Blackwood Hollow, the truth did not stay buried. By 1913, the Blackwood compound stood like a fortress collapsing inward. The cabins sagged, the chapel leaned, and the family itself was fraying at the seams. Ezekiel still thundered his doctrine night after night, but his children had grown hollow under his rule, worn thin by poverty, grief, and the endless cycle of funerals. And at the center of it all was Delilah May. No longer the frightened girl clutching a water bucket, no longer the trembling bride, but a woman carved by sorrow. Her mismatched eyes, one blue, one green, seemed now less a curse than a mirror, reflecting the madness of those around her. She had given birth to 4 children. All dead. Buried in unmarked graves behind the cabin. And though Ezekiel called each death a test of God, the truth gnawed at the family like rot. Something was breaking. The final birth. In the spring of 1914, Delilah carried her 5th child. Her body, ravaged by years of forced pregnancies, could hardly bear the weight. She was sick from the first month, too weak to gather firewood, too weak to cook. When the labor came, it was violent. Hours of screams that carried down the holler. Neighbors miles away later swore they heard the echoes, like the sound of something being torn apart. The child was born still. A girl, silent and pale. Delilah did not weep this time. She only held the child close, refusing to hand her over to Ezekiel, refusing to let him bury her in the woods without a name. For the first time she spoke not to him but to the family gathered around. "This ends with me," she said. Ezekiel raged. He struck her, cursed her, called her the devil's daughter. But the spell was breaking. The family, once so obedient, looked away. Some even wept. They had buried too many children. They had seen too much death. And for the first time they saw not a prophet in Ezekiel, but a tyrant. The fire. No one knows for certain how the fire began. Some say lightning struck the chapel during a summer storm. Others whispered that Delilah herself lit the match, finally rebelling in the only way she could. What we do know is this. One night, flames rose from the Blackwood Hollow. By dawn, the chapel was ash. 2 cabins lay in ruins. And Ezekiel Blackwood was gone. His body never found, his doctrine consumed by fire. Delilah survived. So did her mother, Mary Catherine, though she was said to have wandered the woods in madness until her death. The surviving family scattered. Some changed their names. Others left the mountains entirely. But Delilah remained. The last years. What became of her afterward depends on who tells the story. Some say she lived alone in the ruins of the compound, tending to the graves of her children until the day she died. Others claim she moved deeper into the mountains. Unseen but often heard, her voice singing hymns at night, her mismatched eyes flashing in the moonlight. And there are those who believe she never truly died at all. That her curse, her sorrow, keeps her bound to the hollow. Hunters speak of glimpsing her shadow between the trees. Children dare one another to climb the ridge at night, listening for her cries in the wind. Delilah May Blackwood became not just a woman, not just a victim, but a legend. The Folktale lives. Judge Robert Kinlan's papers preserved the facts, the births, the deaths, the testimonies of neighbors and midwives. But facts alone could not explain the weight of her story. The mountains themselves carried it forward, reshaping it into folklore. She bore her father's children, the old-timers whisper, shaking their heads. And for that, God marked her forever. Some call her a warning against sin. Others, a victim of silence. And a few, just a few, call her something more. A martyr who tried to end the cycle in the only way she could. Whatever the truth, the Blackwood Hollow stands abandoned today. The cabins long since collapsed, the chapel gone to ash, the graves hidden beneath vines and roots. But they say if you walk there at night, you'll hear floorboards creak where no house stands. You'll hear an infant's cry carried on the wind. And if you're unlucky, you'll see her eyes in the dark, one blue, one green, watching, waiting. The end. And that is the story of Delilah May Blackwood, the Devil's Daughter, Appalachia's most disturbing folk tale. Some say it's just legend. Others believe every word. But whether history or haunting, the truth is this: silence let it happen. Silence gave it life. And silence is why her story will never die. If you've stayed with us through the end, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Tell us, do you believe the sins of a family can haunt the land itself? Because in eastern Kentucky, where the mist clings to the ridges like the ghosts of forgotten sins, they'll tell you it already has. Thank you for watching. If this story unsettled you as much as it did us, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss the next tale from the dark corners of history and folklore. And before you go, leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from, and whether you think Delilah May Blackwood was a victim, a sinner, or something far stranger. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, some stories don't stay buried forever.